Good evening and welcome to the Northeast Nebraska Virtual Property Tax Town Hall. I'm Jim Vogel, Chief Executive Officer of the Platt Institute, and I'll be your host tonight. I'm joined by Sarah Curry and Adam Weinberg from my staff. Our team at the Platt Institute focuses on removing barriers to growth and opportunity in Nebraska. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that works with Nebraskans from all different points of view to advance policies that help people keep more of what they earn, make it easier to start and grow a business, and to build a talented workforce in our state. The local property tax burden in Nebraska imposes a barrier in each of those areas. But in recent years, the Nebraska legislature has struggled to build a consensus that would help rein in the taxes on our homes, farms, and businesses. That's where today's town hall comes in. The ball may be in your court as a voter and taxpayer to build support for property tax reform for a future ballot initiative. That means Nebraskans would have to work together to decide what approach would improve the tax system and generate widespread support. Throughout tonight's town hall, the floor is yours. This is an interactive event where you can discuss how property taxes impact you and to share your thoughts on ways to make things better. We'll also discuss the various ideas that have been proposed for property tax reform. You can join the discussion through the chat window or the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen here on Zoom. If you'd like a moment to speak on camera or over audio to share your thoughts, please just include that request with your Q&A submission and a member of our team will get in touch with you by chat. Then I'll call on you when it's time for you to join the discussion. We'll also be running live polls on property tax issues throughout tonight's town hall. Let me show you how it will work by kicking off tonight's first poll question. When we start a new poll, a question will appear on your screen. Just select your answer and click submit to have your vote counted in the poll. For tonight's first question, let's get a sense of how the COVID-19 crisis has impacted your priorities. With everything that has happened during the COVID-19 pandemic in Nebraska, are you more concerned about property taxes, less concerned, or about as concerned as before? Now you can make your selection on the screen. More concerned about property taxes, less concerned, or about as concerned as before. And while we wait for everyone to cast their vote, Sarah, our policy director, can you tell us a bit about what's been going on with the property tax issue in Lincoln now that the legislature has returned?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. There's actually been a lot going on with property tax. There's a bill called 1106, and that's the main property tax vehicle that we have for this session. And even though we had to take that break when we had to stop due to COVID, they've picked right up where they left off, and lawmakers are not wasting any time talking about property tax every single day. Now, because of the shutdowns and the COVID, there's a lot of concerns if the state revenue is available for a property tax reform plan, because we all know that property taxes are levied at the local level. And so the state is trying to spend money, particularly in education, so that way they can lower that education portion of the property tax, yet still keep education whole and not impose any cuts on schools or education in Nebraska. So finding that fine line between how to pay for it and then dealing with all of the, health issues that are going on with the pandemic have been a challenge, and they continue to debate that. Even today, they were talking about it.
Thanks, Sarah. I really appreciate that. And the voting's now closed on tonight's first live poll, and here are the results. 30% of you say that you're more concerned about property taxes, and 70% are about as concerned as before. Thanks for putting that up, Adam. Adam, you watch the polls closely here at the Platt Institute. You're our Communications and Outreach Director. This is the third audience of Nebraskans we've posed this question to this summer. Any thoughts on their response?
Yeah, so far in most of these town halls that we've done, nobody has said, or very few people have said they are less concerned. It seems like it's a fair mix between people who the extent of their concern has increased because there are a lot of people who are hurting economically right now. And so, as some people said on the floor of the legislature when property taxes were debated recently, if you lose your job, property taxes still come due if you'd like to stay on that property. So that is certainly on a lot of people's minds, that this is another economic worry that they're going to have to carry with them through a very difficult time in our state and our nation. At the same time, I would also say, if somebody came to me and said, there are 10 other things I'm worried about right now because of my family's health or my well-being, you wouldn't blame somebody if they said, this isn't as high on my list of priorities. But so far from the folks who have participated at our town halls, they've said that consistently they're still concerned about property taxes, that they want it to be one of the things that policymakers address. And if policymakers don't, tonight we'll talk about maybe some other avenues that Nebraskans can take.
Absolutely, Adam. Thank you so much. So let's talk about one of the concerns on the minds of Nebraska property taxpayers. That is rising property valuations. For a number of years, many observers thought the property tax issue was mainly a problem for ag landowners, but the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City found that home prices in Nebraska have been increasing at the 6th fastest rate in the country over the last decade. And I can attest personally that this is translating into rising valuations and, along with it, rising property taxes for all types of property owners. Sarah and Adam, what are some of the approaches, if any, have been taken at the state and local level to put the brakes on this trend?
Well, a little bit ago, the Nebraska legislature enacted what is LB 103. And what that means is a lot of times the valuation of our homes go up and they don't change the property tax levy, or sometimes they even lower it slightly, but we actually end up paying more in property tax. And so what this means is local government officials actually, by kind of not acting, they're having a property tax increase, right? Because they're taking more of our money away from us in the form of taxes. And so what LB 103 did is it said anytime that there's any more money being collected from the citizenry, from you and I, that they have to hold a hearing. It essentially puts their feet to the fire and says, just because you're not doing anything doesn't mean you're not just collecting more money, and it is an effective tax increase. And so that's what LB 103 did, and we've seen a little bit of that going on in Nebraska. It's a relatively new law, and a lot of people don't know about it, but you can go and listen to your local board, and they have to explain to you why they're doing it and what they're planning to spend that money on.
Yeah, and Jim, one of the good things about LB 103 is it does create that process where policymakers at the local level have to go on the record. If they want to capture that windfall from increasing valuations on property in their community and in their taxing jurisdiction, then they do have to hold that hearing, and they do have to take a public vote and say, rather than reducing levies back to the equivalent that my revenue would basically be constant, which is what the law requires them to do, is bring the levies down in correspondence with how valuations broadly went up. And if they don't want to do that, then they have to hold this hearing and this vote. So from a transparency standpoint, it was a really big deal that the legislature advanced and unanimously passed this bill. But it's transparency on paper. The question is, and that we've seen between 2019 and 2020 when LB 103 was in practice as law, is does anybody know about this law? One of the reasons we're talking about it tonight is so more people can know about it. They can show up to these public hearings, which I've taken to calling the LB 103 hearing. It's a separate hearing. Instead of them just adopting the property tax increase as part of adopting a whole budget, they have to adopt this separately in a hearing. But the question is, do voters and taxpayers have the information right now to take advantage of this opportunity that they have to engage with local political subdivisions? If you look on your property tax bill, you'll see that I think where I live, there's 8, 9, 10 different subdivisions that have taxing authority. So it takes a lot of organization if I want to engage all of them when valuations for my property or in my community go up. So these are all questions that people have to contend with if they're not happy with the local property tax burden and they'd like to get involved at the local level. Here's an opportunity, yes, but the question is, could more be done at the legislative or grassroots level to make sure people know about that opportunity, that they can be engaged with it? So that's one thing that is going on right now with the LB 103. There's other proposals that have been out there in this legislative session. There was a proposed constitutional amendment that came through the legislature. It was a resolution to put a 3% cap on the growth of property tax revenue at a local political subdivision level. It could have been overridden with voter approval, but basically what it would have done is if you levy $100 in property taxes this year, next year that district or that jurisdiction could only levy $103 of property taxes. So it wouldn't apply to your property specifically, it'd apply to the whole jurisdiction, whole political subdivision. But the idea was, okay, 3%, that's tapped out. If you want to go more beyond 3% in your budget, you can, but then you have to find some other kind of revenue source or find some other way that people in your community want to pitch in, or you have to get voters to approve to override it. So that did not move ahead in this legislative session. I think there are some reasons that the objections of local political subdivisions who felt that that was too restrictive. But these are questions that we're going to be asking people tonight. What do you think should be done? What do you think is a reasonable limit? Because clearly without additional limitations on property taxing authority, we're going to continue to see property taxes rise if valuations continue on the trend that they have been.
Absolutely. Thanks, Adam. Sarah, as you mentioned, the Nebraska legislature made its return to session last week and now has until August 13th to pass its own property tax proposal. Can you fill us in on some of the details of that legislation, LB 1106, please?
Yeah, so like I said before, LB 1106 really focuses on the school district property tax aspect. So when we look at property taxes as a whole, we can estimate that on average, 60% of Nebraska's property tax is from the school district. And so that's really the main focus. And every time we hear a property tax debate in the legislature, the focus really is on school funding and how we change that. So, you know, there's some bad sides to 1106. I'm not going to lie. It's not a perfect bill. And if it passes, that doesn't mean that the problem is solved. It's not going to magically fix itself overnight. The state wants to take more money. So income tax and sales tax money that goes to the state, they want to send it essentially to the school districts to help pay for public education. Now, some people are saying this is necessarily needed because Nebraska ranks very low when we look at state funding of public education. But when we look at local funding of education, we're one of the highest. So it depends on which statistic you use. On the other side of 1106, while it's good that they hold the school districts whole and the bill does not cut funding to the school districts, it also doesn't limit the growth on the other side. So we were just talking about that constitutional amendment for a 3% growth cap. There's no cap on school districts. So they can continue to grow, they can continue to, you know, issue new spending, which again, if government doesn't spend money, then there's no reason to tax us. So that's really what's driving this whole property tax problem is spending. And so that's one of the faults with 1106. Again, it's a good bill. It's a step in the right direction. It's better than what we have right now, but it's not the end all be all. And we're still going to have work to do in the future.
And one of the reasons for that, of course, is because, as I said before, we have many political subdivisions that rely heavily on property tax and not just school districts. So while school districts are a big part of the puzzle, especially if you live in an unequalized school district where you feel that you could be having access to a lot more state support than you have now, everybody's paying property taxes to a variety of different subdivisions. And as your valuations go up, or if tax levies don't get adjusted, even if we do get a handle on the school district side of it, if your city, county, community college, whatever, if that continues to move in the direction it will, that could undo a lot of the progress that the legislature is seeking on the school district side.
I appreciate that, Adam. I've been at the Platte Institute for 8 years now, and I think you've hit the 6-year mark, and we've been watching the legislature for many years. Tell us why it's been such a long road, Adam, in trying to pass a property tax reform in the legislature.
Well, you know, when we first started out working on tax policy here at the Platte Institute, Jim, we would often spend time looking at the Revenue Committee, which is where they decide on all the tax bills, and would say, gosh, if a tax bill could just get through the Revenue Committee, it'd be smooth sailing once we get to the floor of the Nebraska legislature. And then we started to see for a number of years that isn't such a smooth sailing strategy either. Because Nebraska's legislature, unique and nonpartisan, and there's a lot of great features about it that I think are wonderful for people to be involved, especially our hearing process. But one thing that is unique that makes it a challenge to pass property tax reform is the fact that we're one of the few state legislative bodies that has a filibuster rule. So in the case of the filibuster rule, and there's positives and negatives to filibusters, but the reality is in the case of property tax reform, the minority can rule. And you can have 17 senators veto what the majority of senators may wish to do on property tax reform issues. And if you can't persuade those 17 senators for whatever reason that it's not in their interest to move forward on property tax reform, that puts you in a tough bind, because you would say, okay, I'm going to go campaign on property taxes and tell my constituents how much I believe in that and want to do it. And then at the end of the day, your constituents say, how come you didn't do anything? And you could have voted for every property tax proposal to get through committee and get to the floor. And if you still have that filibuster in place, and I'm not saying that that is the only problem or objection, but it is a reason that the legislative process is the way it is, because in most other state legislatures, bicameral as they may all be, if the majority of senators or state representatives decide they want to pass a bill, they pass a bill. And if you get it through 2 chambers and you have a governor who wants to agree to it, they sign it into law. So we have that obstacle where, because of some of the divides in our state, and sometimes they are urban and rural, and sometimes they're born out of of the different public and private sector interest groups that are in our legislature and our state policy process. We just haven't been able to overcome the fact that there seem to always be at least 17 members who don't agree to it. And I think one of the difficulties is, you know, there are lots of ideas out there about how you can achieve property tax reform. Some of them would involve spending restraints that might not be able to get 33 votes from maybe people who are more progressive leaning. Some of them might involve new revenue sources that might not be able to get 33 votes because of some members who would call themselves more conservative leaning. So you've got every which way that no matter how you slice it, it's tough to overcome the fact that 17 members just may not want to do it. And so that's where we are right now, and why a lot of people are asking themselves, is the legislative process the way to go when it comes to property tax reform? Obviously, we've tried very hard and will continue to work with senators because we think that they have done a lot of great work on the policy side. But when it comes to votes, very often you don't get a vote on property tax reform. You get a vote on a cloture bill, a cloture vote on a bill, and then you can't overcome that.
Yeah, there are many special interest groups, as you just stated, that want the status quo to continue, and it's pretty easy in our unicameral system to get 17 senators to buy into that philosophy. So legislation is one way the property tax issue can be approached, but another way is through a voter initiative, which we're here tonight to get feedback from each of you about. There are two ways initiatives can get on the ballot in Nebraska. First is that a state senator can introduce a resolution for a ballot measure. But in order for an issue to get in front of voters that way, the legislature would have to approve giving Nebraskans the chance to vote on either a law or a constitutional amendment. That's not likely to happen with property tax reform because the legislature has struggled to even pass its own legislation. So the second way an issue gets on the ballot is through a petition drive that is authorized by the Nebraska Secretary of State. Adam, you want to talk a bit about how petition drives generally work?
Sure. Well, yeah, as you said, I mean, you can get it through the legislature if you can overcome the filibuster. And if you can't overcome the filibuster, then you've got to do it yourself as a petition drive effort. And a petition drive effort, typically to be successful, it needs to be a paid signature gathering effort. And the reason why is the threshold to accomplish it is quite high. There's two types of ballot initiatives. There's legislation through a ballot initiative, or there's a constitutional amendment. They have two different thresholds. So if you pass an initiative for legislation, you need signatures from 7% of the registered voters in that year. If you want to pass a constitutional amendment, then it has to be 10% of the registered voters. And you have to get those signatures submitted before 4 months before the general election that you want to have that on the ballot for. You also, as an added threshold to make sure that you're not just collecting your signatures in 1 or 2 major cities, you have to make sure that you get 5% of the registered voters signed on your petition from, I believe it's 38 counties, so that you have a representative sampling of voters across the state. Now, the process for collecting those signatures, one of the reasons it's so arduous and so costly, is that you have to make sure that you follow whoever this campaign committee is that's authorized by the Secretary of State to follow the letter of the law, in that the signature gatherers have to be authorized circulators. They have to go to each individual signature, petition signature that they collect has to be collected individually. They have to make sure they follow the letter of the law and they do it. And then when they collect those signatures in a given county, they have to be collecting signatures only in that given county, and those voters have to be registered in that given county for it to be counted. So ultimately, if you collect 120,000 signatures, because that's what you need, you'd be out of luck, because really some of those signatures are not going to be valid. People are not going to register to vote. People are going to sign in the wrong county. Some people are against you or your campaign issue, and they're going to screw your petition signatures up and waste your time. So that is why if you look at the campaigns that appear poised to qualify for the general election ballot this year, and a property tax campaign as far as reform is concerned is not one of them. These were paid petition gathering campaigns that went out to make sure that they gathered more than their share to make sure that they could be validated for the ballot. And as we saw with the past 2 property tax ballot petitions, they were more grassroots, volunteer-driven campaigns. They had a lot of enthusiasm behind them, but those are some of the difficulties they hit, where when it came to a big crisis like COVID-19, it was just too much for that campaign, especially this year, to overcome. In terms of being able to generate the necessary signatures to qualify for the ballot. And that's just getting to the part where you start the campaign, because then you have to take the slings and arrows of a general election campaign where certainly you're going to face opposition.
Thanks, Adam. One of the positives clearly for pursuing a ballot initiative is that voters can bypass the legislature and the governor if they feel their leaders aren't giving enough consideration to their priorities. But what are some of the downsides and why aren't we voting on a property ballot initiative this year? Sarah, Adam?
Well, you can go ahead, Sarah, because I already let some of that hot air out.
No, I was just going to say one of the downsides is kind of the situation that the state was in back in the 1960s. And so I'm going to go back and do a little bit of history for you. In 1965, the state had a ballot initiative, and it was to eliminate the state property tax. And so that went through. And so the state didn't have an income tax or sales tax at the time. That was the only tax we had. So in 1966, the state had no revenue whatsoever. So in 1967, Nebraska created the income and the sales tax. We were one of the last states in the country to create an income tax and sales tax. So it kind of caused a problem. Now, I'm not saying that was good because the state property tax went away and it was very burdensome, but now it's kind of bad looking back because we have high income taxes, high sales taxes, and we still have high property taxes. So there's pluses and minuses to everything, and it's really important to weigh the balance of that.
And one of the positives, thank you, Sarah, is that, like you said, the public gets to overcome the legislative or policymaking process if they don't feel that it's representing them. But the negative is that because policymakers either failed to or were not able to put the pieces together to pass a policy, they're not able to do some of the more detail-oriented work that some of these complicated policies involve. Because there are tough questions that policymakers have to decide about. How are we going to collect taxes to pay for the commitments that the public wants us to pay for? How are we going to structure these policies that sometimes are just really hard to answer on a ballot because the tax code is huge and it involves a lot of moving pieces. And so the temptation is to think, well, we can just go and we'll decide it through direct democracy. And sometimes that works really well. And sometimes it has long-term ramifications and unintended consequences that then it puts your policymakers in a situation where they have to decide based on limitations that maybe they would not have chosen otherwise. Now, some people would say, and sometimes I will be inclined to agree, sometimes government should be limited in a way that people don't want it to exceed certain boundaries. And people say, we've seen some abuses here and we'd like to make sure that those don't happen in the future. But sometimes even when you pass a positive limitation, there are other trade-offs that come along with it. So some of that detailed policy work can sometimes be taken off the table and you don't have as much flexibility in the future.
Thanks, guys. Really appreciate it. So let's go through and talk about some of the ideas that people have brought forth on ballot initiatives. And by the way, if you have an idea for a property tax ballot initiative, you can share it in the Q&A section. You're even welcome to chime in on camera or audio if you'd like to join in on the discussion. One of the issues we've discussed at the Platt Institute is eliminating sales tax exemptions in order to achieve property tax reform. But we have some reason to believe that can be a challenge to accomplish through a voter initiative. Adam and Sarah, do you want to talk about some of those challenges and what we're talking about when we speak of eliminating sales tax exemptions?
Yeah, sure. So really basic, when we talk about sales tax, right? That's the tax that you pay when you go to buy something. You buy a pair of socks, you pay sales tax on that. Well, there are certain things that are exempt from the sales tax, and some things make sense, right? Like a business investment. If I work in a manufacturing business and I buy a big machine, and that machine is central to my business operations, I don't pay sales tax on that because that's called a business input. So it is part of the finished product. And we don't want tax pyramiding, which is where if you pay sales tax on this part, this part, this part, this part, at the end, the price is much higher. And so that's not good either. But when we talk about sales tax exemptions, we talk about just complete products or just industries that don't pay sales tax. So this might surprise you, but next time you go get a massage or a haircut, or, you know, ladies, if we go get our nails done, there's no sales tax on that. I mean, you might not realize it, but there isn't. A lot of states pay sales tax on that. If you go get your car worked on, there's no sales tax on that. Now, if you go and buy like new rugs to put in your car, or floor mats, that's what they're called, floor mats, you pay sales tax on that, but you don't pay sales tax on the labor. And so it gets really tricky sometimes when you've got businesses and part of it's, you know, exempt and part of it isn't. This is a fun fact. If we levied sales tax on everything, I mean, just everything, even business inputs, it would pay for the state's general fund. We could eliminate property tax essentially. And so that's kind of the argument. Get rid of sales tax exemptions, even on business inputs, and get rid of property tax and just replace it. And the concept there is that if you don't have the money, you're not going to buy it. So you're only taxed on stuff that you voluntarily purchase. Now, this gets us into the discussion of taxing food. A lot of states do tax food, lower levels like 1%, 0.5%, 2% max, not the full 6 or 7%. But that can kind of get confusing as well. So I know, for example, in Iowa, if you go over there and you buy lemonade, it's taxed because that's considered a processed food. Or if you buy just potatoes, it's not taxed. And so sometimes it gets really confusing on what's taxed and what isn't. But then we see states like Tennessee. They have no income tax. They have very, very low property tax, but they have the highest sales tax in the nation. And Tennessee's economy is growing and people are moving there. So it obviously isn't an idea that people are opposed to, or they wouldn't be moving to Tennessee. So that's kind of sales tax expansion. And there's actually, if you hear about the consumption tax, that's the same thing. It's just where you pay sales tax on stuff, because it's stuff that you are consuming.
Well, and we'll talk a little bit about the consumption tax, I think, in a moment, Jim. But the sales tax is a consumption tax. It's just, that's another word for it. It's a longer, more vocab word there. But the sales tax, in theory, is supposed to be on the goods and services that you buy in the consumer economy. And you would think that, as Sarah said, there are a lot of things that you might take for granted would have sales tax on them, but they actually don't. In fact, most of the things we buy in Nebraska don't actually have sales tax being collected on them. So here at the office in the morning, if I want to bring everybody McDonald's, if I want to bring them Egg McMuffins, I'm going to pay sales tax on them because I bought them in a restaurant. But if I decide to bring everybody donuts instead, donuts are considered a bakery item and they're exempt from sales tax because they're considered more like a grocery item. And that's just one small example, because you could get into all sorts of illogical situations where if I decide I'm going to buy a lawnmower and mow my own lawn, as it's been said in the legislature, I'll pay sales tax on the lawnmower. But if I go hire somebody to bring their lawnmower and mow a lawn, there's no sales tax on that because most services in Nebraska are exempt. So that's one of our proposals that we've written about a lot at platinstitute.org. Is certainly that is a way that a lot of people have shown favor towards, that people feel that it's more voluntary in a sense, that they can decide what they want to consume, which goods and services they want to buy. And the truth is, services which are exempt, often higher income people consume more of them because they have more disposable income to hire other people to do stuff for them. I'm still of the set where I'm doing my own lawn when I'm doing it. And so, I wouldn't pay as much sales tax on getting somebody to mow my lawn for me. Where I would probably plunk it down is when my dogs go to the vet. Right now, most veterinary medical care is exempt. Most of the stuff I buy for them at the veterinarian is exempt. Now, it's not when I go and buy them dog food, when I go and buy them the toys and all that kind of stuff, that's not exempt. So you can see there's a lot of confusion about what is and is not taxable under the sales tax. And our argument would be, if people are open to it, because it's a tax, don't get me wrong, paying sales tax is not great either. And we don't want to pay too high of a sales tax either. But if people want an alternative to property tax that doesn't involve raising the tax rates that we pay, getting rid of sales tax exemptions is certainly a way that can be done, and that we have seen other states do it. Our neighbors in South Dakota do it, where they tax a much broader range of goods and services, and they're able to use that revenue where they have a very stable source of revenue. It doesn't fluctuate as much as many other states, and they can do it without relying at all on income taxes, either at the personal or corporate level. And they even have lower property taxes than we do. They don't have an inheritance tax. They rely very little in the way of personal property taxes. So there are benefits, but I want to say before we get farther into this, there are downsides that people perceive to relying on sales tax. I think, and this is a good thing in a way. I think in the United States, we have a very populist way of looking at taxes in general. And yeah, it's nice that I don't have to pay tax on something. At least at some place I get a break, right? So I think a lot of people would say there are fairness and equity issues in terms of, what if I have to buy something or I consider something to be a necessity? Now, what we would argue, and what people who support consumption taxes and the policy we're going to talk about would argue, is there are ways to make up for that, like tax credits and other ways to, kind of like what we're doing right now, quite frankly, with the CARES Act, where we've cut a check to people to make sure that the most vulnerable aren't left behind. And there are ways that other states and countries have done that to make up for some of the regressivity concerns. But people instinctively you know, we've done polling on this, and you can go check it out at plattinstitute.org/polls. We've asked people, would you pay sales taxes? And if we used all on these exempt services and goods, if we used all the money to cut your property taxes? And a lot of people say, yeah, I want to do that. And then we get into more specifics and we say, okay, well, so does that mean you're going to be okay paying sales taxes on your groceries? Well, then people pull back. You say, well, what about paying sales taxes on your gasoline? Well, then some people peel off even more. What about on your haircut, and so on and so forth? So the more specific you get, the more people say, well, is it really so bad? Would I rather continue paying property tax than these other kinds of taxes? Now, if you ask a lot of people in ag, they're going to say, absolutely, somebody else has to pay these taxes because of the inordinate increase in land values and resultant increase in property taxes. And I think the question we have is, if we're going to do sales tax reform, how do we build a consensus so that nobody feels like they're being left out and put upon, so that we can make our tax system better for our future? Those are tough questions.
Thanks, Adam. For the record, I'll take either a donut or an Egg McMuffin tomorrow morning. All right. So there are senators in the legislature who want to supercharge this idea of expanding the sales tax by moving to what they call a consumption tax, which is meant to sweeten the deal by proposing to get rid of most other taxes in Nebraska. What is that, and why are some people trying to float it as a ballot initiative idea? You both just alluded to the distinction between a consumption tax and a sales tax. It's virtually the same thing. If you guys want to expand on that, the floor is yours.
Yeah, so let's look at one of the downsides, right? On the benefit, you pay tax on what you consume, and so some would say you have a choice. Others not. So I have 2 young children. We buy lots of diapers. We buy lots of wet wipes. I pay lots of sales tax on those diapers and wet wipes. So what happens to people with lots of children, right? We usually try to help people out with children, and they usually consume a lot of stuff because we're buying lots of clothes and lots of food and that kind of stuff. And so if there was a sales tax on everything, my tax burden might actually be much higher than somebody else's. And usually we give like the per child tax credit, you know, try to help people out for having children. So that's one angle of it. Another angle is that this is a statistic, lower income people tend to consume more than higher income people, which makes the sales tax or the consumption tax regressive. And that means that it affects lower income people more than upper income people. And so that's also a negative. And Adam alluded to the fact that sometimes we give states that have this type of setup, give some sort of credit or deduction to offset for that, but it would affect the lower income more. So it's not perfect. It sounds good, but just like any tax plan, really, there's good sides and there's bad sides.
Thanks, Sarah. Adam, you have anything?
Yeah, and just to do credit to the supporters of this potential initiative idea, it's out there in the legislature right now. It was before the Revenue Committee. There was a hearing for LR300CA, excuse me. And so there was a hearing. There were a lot of people who showed up, and a lot of people showed up for it because what it offers is pretty appealing. It offers basically, if you were to pay sales tax on pretty much everything you buy, except for used goods, these are just consumer things, so no business inputs, but basically everything that you would buy except for used goods would be taxable under the sales tax. It would be, in my opinion, a hefty sales tax. It would have to be in the double digits. The supporters estimated at the time that it would be around 11%. Now they're saying potentially it could be around 10.5%. And what it would do, and the reason so many people at the hearing were excited about it, is the theory is that it could be used to replace virtually every tax that we have in Nebraska. It could be used to replace the personal and corporate income tax, the inheritance tax, and certainly, as is the subject of tonight's discussion, the real and personal property taxes. And so when people hear that, that sounds really appealing because you basically replace a battery of taxes with one tax, and you get to decide when you pay it. And so a lot of people feel that they have control over that. The other thing that supporters would say, because of the revenue that they would collect with this, they would say they can afford to offer what they call a prebate. It's kind of like, if you're familiar with the fair tax, which is a national tax policy idea, where they would give everybody a certain rebate in advance for what their basic consumption would be, so that you wouldn't be taxing people on their day-to-day consumption. Now, there are positives and negatives to that approach that you can talk about from a tax policy standpoint. I also think there are governance issues that you have to talk about if this policy were to be seriously considered, which is, there are a lot of communities that don't have a lot of consumption in a retail in their area. There are communities that all they've got really is property. So people who like local control for local political subdivisions, they're either going to have to depend on the state to get their revenues, or they're going to have to come up with some kind of means by which they can tap into consumption the tax that they might not have very much of in their community. So there are issues with that. I think the most recent version of this, like I said, it would have gotten rid of almost every tax except for the gas tax, which is an excise tax you pay on motor fuel. And you would, of course, have to pay this consumption tax on things like gasoline and groceries and some pretty controversial things for a lot of people. And it would have to be a hefty tax rate, of course, because to replace all these other taxes, you're talking about, you know, billions and billions of dollars in revenue that you would have to replace. So it would be a really specific policy choice that we would have to make as a state. And I think, especially for people who live in a border area where, you know, where I live in Omaha, if I'm, as I've said to some other folks, if my wife tells me to go to the corner to get a loaf of bread, I'm probably not going to worry too much about paying 10 or 11 cents on the on sale bread that I'm going to buy. But if I have to buy a couple $100s worth of something, I'm going to think very carefully about whether I would want to buy someplace else or find alternatives to what I would otherwise normally buy because of that. Now, some people would say the system works then. We're controlling consumption and revenue. So those are some of the issues that would have to be dealt with.
Sarah, we've got a question in our Q&A that deals directly with these sales tax exemptions. Let's take Sharon's question before we go to our next poll. And that question is, so is every expense a farmer has, like fertilizer, seed inputs, considered a business input?
So that's a very interesting question, Sharon, because there is no legal definition for business input. So technically you could say this pen that I'm using right now to take notes on is a business input. But then other people are going to say it's not. So yes, hypothetically, every single thing a farmer uses is an input, right? Because he's putting it, he or she is putting it into the ground or into their livestock, and then they're taking it to market. So you could even say the tires on the trailer, you know, driving it to market is a business input. So at some point that line has to be drawn, and everyone is drawing it at a different place. Oh, and don't worry, you're not chewing up too much time. It's a great question. So
that was actually me. I was telling you I was chewing up too much time, so we got to hurry it up.
But yeah, so Sharon, it's where we draw that line. And South Dakota has kind of taken a different approach where they do tax some business inputs. Their economy doesn't seem to be hurting that badly from it, but you know, we do see some evidence of tax pyramiding. So that does occur, and that's something that the legislature debates a lot when we talk about eliminating sales tax exemptions. Like a perfect example is for services for accountants and attorneys. A lot of businesses use legal fees and accountants. Is that a business input or is that a service? You know, we don't have a strict definition on that, and every state treats it a little bit differently. And then there was another, another question.
Let's get to a poll, Sarah. We're going to get to a poll, and then we're going to address some of the two other questions.
Yeah, thanks for the great questions, everybody. Let's watch poll number 2.
So the next poll, and then we're going to go back to questions. How would you vote on a constitutional amendment to end local property and state income taxes, replacing them with a 10.5% sales tax on all new consumer goods and services you purchase? Let us know now. Would you support, opposed, or are you undecided? And part of that discussion that we've just had, Sarah and Adam, and this gets to a question that Steve has in the Norfolk area. Most of the ideas given so far seem to be examples of robbing Peter to pay Paul, increasing revenue somewhere to offset current property taxes being paid. But since the main cause of increased property taxes are from increased local spending by taxing entities, what reforms can we push that incentivize voters to better keep accountable these entities and push them towards decreased spending and increasing the efficiency of public services?
Well, Steve, that's a really, really good point that you bring up. And I think the core philosophical issue that we have to discuss there is what is a core function of government, and what is a role for government, and what is a role for the private sector. So a lot of us think about, you know, our utilities, right? Water, roads, public safety. Those are functions for government. Now let's talk about some other things. Our water parks, functions of government. Our golf courses, functions of government. There's a business incubators. I mean, some people say yes and some people say no. So I think we have to discuss that, right? Because the more we spend, the more we have to tax. a great example, right, is a park. Now, some can say that the park is there for everybody, but I know, at least in my park, everybody in town doesn't go to the park, but everybody in town pays for that park because they pay property tax. So should that park have a user fee? You know, that's a question we have to ask ourselves when we want to start lowering spending. And so that's the thing. A lot of people consume these government services, and the government services have to go away if we're not going to spend money on it, because, you know, that takes equipment to upkeep a lot of this stuff, and then you have employees to upkeep and oversee and maintain stuff. So it's kind of this double-edged sword, right? Are you willing to deal with less to have a lower property tax, or just general tax in overall?
And I'll point out, Sarah and Adam, that part of LB 1106, because Steve asked what kind of reforms would we push or we know about at the Platt Institute that would limit spending. Part of LB 1106 does have spending constraints for school expense growth. Is that correct?
Actually, yes, it does. Yeah, that's the side it does.
2%, I believe.
Yeah, it's been one of the issues that's led to this extended discussion about how much should school spending be allowed to increase. And that's one of the sticking points, and why that issue has been amended and debated. But you know, we'll have to see it before August 13th if that can be something that is agreed to, because I think even more than whether the state has revenue to do some kind of structural reform, it really is what kind of limitations are going to be placed on property taxing subdivisions. And in this case, they're only talking about schools, which means we're only talking about a portion of the issue. But that's part of it. And I think we're going to talk about spending here with Ron, one of our guests, in just a minute. So I think we'll get to more of the spending discussion momentarily. But Jim, in the Q&A section, we have a very nice question. And it was, have any of the states that expanded their sales tax base then been able to lower their sales tax rate? If we eliminated exemptions in Nebraska, and I actually lost the rest of the question. I think here's, see if I can find it. But basically, Jim, do you happen to have that in front of you? I think it disappeared from somebody clicking.
If we eliminated the exemptions in Nebraska, would there be enough revenue to greatly reduce property taxes and also lower the sales tax rate?
Well, yes, if you did a lot. If you did a lot of them, because if you basically were able to reduce, if we decided we wanted to get rid of all consumer sales tax exemptions, then the amount would be in the billions of dollars, and you would have an amount left over where you could certainly decide how much do you want to dedicate. And you can check that out at plattinstitute.org/policy, where Sarah and I wrote a paper on sales tax reform, where we talk about it would raise a significant amount of revenue. The question is, are people up for that broad of a base broadening where they would pay on all these things that, frankly, they're not accustomed to paying sales tax on? And people have to ask themselves, are they as concerned about property taxes that they would be willing to adopt those kinds of changes in their daily life and how they pay their taxes? And we've even supported bills. Listen, there's more than one way to reform the tax code to make it better. We think property taxes are the concern that taxpayers have most, but if we got rid of all sales tax exemptions, we could even use it to cut the sales tax really significantly if we wanted. So that's another thing to keep in mind, is if people can't ever agree on property taxes, there are other ways to reduce the tax rate that we pay. And I think the most recent bill we saw this year, you could get it down to maybe even 2 or 3%. The state sales tax, if you really broaden the sales tax base. So it's something you can do. It's something other states have looked at doing. I think of some states in recent times, like Utah, that has tried to do it. They've had some difficulty with doing it, but there are states that have broader sales tax bases than Nebraska that do have lower tax rates. So it's certainly one possibility. And Jim, we're ready to share the results of the poll.
Yeah, I was just going to say, let's see what the folks tonight in Northeast Nebraska think. 44% say they would support a 10.5% sales tax on all consumer goods and services, and 56% say undecided, but nobody at this point say that they would oppose. And as Sarah properly pointed out, we have seen other states that have broadened their base and used that revenue to lower rates, whether it's income tax, property tax, or certainly sales tax, and we've got billions on the table, depending on how far the appetite is. All right, before we get to the next segment, do we want to address one more question in the Q&A?
Yeah, sure. Susan had a good question. There was many older Nebraskans living on limited fixed incomes rely on the homestead exemption credit to help them with their property tax burden? Do we, the Platt Institute, support reducing the homestead exemption or shifting the cost of the exemption from the state to local counties? I can't speak for everybody else in the staff, but I don't think we've ever even really discussed that. My suspicion would be, first of all, the answer would be no. And the reason would be, at the end of the day, you have to have some kind of homestead exemption for people who simply cannot pay their property taxes because they don't have the means to do so. I do know that the chair of the Revenue Committee, Senator Linehan, has talked about how the states need to fund the homestead exemption has increased really significantly, and that's because property taxes continue to increase. So as property taxes continue to increase, the state has to, and it is a state-funded program, as Susan pointed out right now. So there has to be some type of homestead exemption or some type of policy to account for the fact that some people are going to be in an economic circumstance where they simply won't be able to just be guided by what the market value of their home is. So that would not be how we would look at it. Of course, yeah, as you point out, it does make it complicated because as that cost increases, the ability for the state to use revenue to offset other property taxes broadly also is diminished.
All right, Sarah, do you have anything else on that? Otherwise, we're going to move on to the program.
No, I'm good.
All right. So eliminating sales tax exemptions and funding property tax relief is one way to attack the problem. Let's talk in more detail about a different proposal. State Senator Ben Hansen introduced a bill that would have created a transparency measure to go along with LB 103, which was discussed earlier. That's the law that requires local governments to hold a public hearing and vote if they want to collect a windfall from increasing property valuations. But what Senator Hansen bill does is require that taxpayers receive advance notice by mail about these public hearings so they can know where to express their concerns about a potential tax increase. In other states, this concept is known as truth in taxation. Looks like this idea is not going to move forward this year, but what are the positives and negatives in your views, Sarah and Adam?
Well, I think the truth in taxation law adds teeth to the law that was passed last year, because as I said, we have these hearings now that everyone has the ability to attend when their local political subdivisions are going to decide on a property tax increase. The issue is, unless you're paying very close attention in a newspaper of record, and not everybody subscribes to the newspaper these days, I'm sorry to say, and you may not be in the area where you can get that information, or you may not be following your local political subdivision very closely. So what the truth in taxation policy seeks to do is give people that ability to be notified by mail so that they can know where their local governments are making these decisions, where they can go to be involved, express their concerns. And in other states that have this policy, they even itemize for taxpayers what the potential tax increase would be. And they can decide for themselves then if it's worth getting involved or not. And obviously we think it's a good idea. So we're taking a petition right now on our site if you're interested to support truth in taxation, because there is legislation out there to make it move forward. Now, if I can, in full disclosure, offer a negative, and some people may not think it's a negative, but one of the negatives of truth in taxation that has been seen in states that have it is that taxpayers, because they receive that mailed notice, they realize what's at stake. They go to these local meetings, they're engaged with their boards, and sometimes, because politicians might get nervous at seeing all of these people show up to these meetings, they might not adopt an increase in property taxes where it is reasonable to do so. So if there were smaller increases that were more in keeping with the growth of the community, in the needs of the community and the growth of the economy, if they delay that for long enough, maybe someday when there is a real need, it's been delayed so long, they have to adopt a big increase in property taxes. So I think that is important to keep in mind, that you have to have some give and take and understanding that policymakers at the local level aren't always out to do bad. They have to make decisions that we've charged them to make with limited resources sometimes. And so I think that's one of the downsides that you have to keep in mind. But I do think Nebraskans usually are pretty understanding overall when property taxing subdivisions come to them and say, you know, we need your support for this kind of measure.
Yeah, and that's what's gotten us into trouble over the last few years, is that political subdivisions collect a windfall because valuations go up and then they decide to spend the money. We just saw that here when Mayor Stothard announced the budget here in Omaha. Going back to Steve's question, property tax increases generally are the result of increased spending. All right, we're going to move on to our next poll as it relates to what we just talked about. How would you vote on a ballot initiative requiring taxpayers to be provided with notice by mail of all public hearings where property taxes may be increased? Let us know if you support, opposed, or undecided. Sarah, the Platt Institute team testified on truth and taxation in the legislature. What were some of the reactions you've heard so far?
Well, overall in the legislature, people were supportive of it. They thought it was a great idea. I think the problem that we've seen with it is that it's getting the local governments to actually do it and actually comply with it. They think that they're telling people, or they think that they're having these hearings where they just flat out don't want to. And so there's not really teeth in it. It's not really, there's no consequence, if you will, right? If a town or district wants to raise their taxes, what recourse is there if they choose not to hold their truth and taxation hearing? So I think that's the problem we've got moving forward with it, is that there's no teeth in the bill or the legislation to make it happen.
Thanks, Sarah. Now let's take a look at our poll results from the previous poll question. All right, 89% of you said that you would support receiving that notice, and 11% say that you would oppose. Thank you very much for voting. All right, we've talked about a couple of ways to change the law so property taxes are either more limited or are replaced with other kinds of taxes. But there are plenty of Nebraskans who think for tax reform to be meaningful, changes to government spending have to be part of this mix. To get the conversation kicked off, we've got Ron from Norfolk joining us now. Ron, welcome to the virtual property tax town hall. Go ahead and provide your thoughts.
It's been a very interesting conversation, I got to say. And it brings up one point, that it truly is all about the money. And there's a lot of different reactions. I know I've always been one that felt that sales tax is the fairest tax that there is, because you do have a choice and of whether you're going to spend the money or not. And those that pay, or those that spend, pay. But there is a caveat that was brought up tonight that, you know, some people are sometimes forced into spending additional monies for items that they just have to have, and they can't afford it. So there probably is some other aspects of it that I had never considered before that would have to be looked at and taken care of. But overall, I think that probably the tax issue seems to always come back to who's taxing the most. Fortunately, in Norfolk, we have a very active local government. We're mainly supported with sales tax. I was on the city council for a number of years, and every year they do put a percentage increase max on it. And if any department wants to go over that percent, and it's usually 2% or 3%, they had to show a good reason why they would, or why they needed to. And I think they've done a very good job of control. The county I have not been that much involved with. I can't really say that I've seen them not control it. I think they have pretty well. Schools, I haven't totally been involved with them. But, you know, having said that, they are the largest user of the property tax. Like you said, 60%. I think our city was something like 11% or 12% was all. And so that's the one that everybody looks at, right or wrong. But the one thing I can tell you is that, you know, if the legislature can't figure it out and they can't show leadership in this, then the ballot initiative will come about. I mean, it failed now because of the COVID problem, but eventually it would come about. And I think that the people that really need to take a look at this is maybe not totally the legislature. When I was in industry, in charge of a department, the way we cut costs was I would put a group together, and I would not ask the people in the packaging department to give me cost cutting for the production department because they don't know anything about it. I think what really has to happen, and I know right away there's an uproar if they talk about putting a cap on the school spending. I think what has to happen is the people that are involved with the school, the teachers union, the principals, the leaders in the school, they have to get together and they have to come up with ideas of how they can maybe lower their spending or control their spending. They're the ones that work with it day after day. Are there instances where there is waste? There absolutely is. And I'm not going to go into those, but there is. And I would say in any part of government, any part of industry, we were amazed in our industry how much we were able to cut costs when we really made it a primary event to do. And each of us was judged on what we did. It was amazing. It really was.
Well, Ron, I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your thoughts. You are so right that taxes are certainly tied to spending, and so far the unicameral hasn't found a way to get tax reform in general over the finish line. And it doesn't matter if it's property tax reform or some of the other tough issues that didn't pass in the session. It seems like ballot initiatives might be the way that we see things get done in the future. And that's why it's so important that people like you have engaged us tonight. So thank you very much. Sarah, did you want to maybe talk real quickly about the North Carolina or North Dakota ballot initiative?
Yeah, I mean, one of the questions here is, are there states that do without property taxes? Because that's what we're talking about with things like the consumption tax. And the answer is no, right now there aren't. So that is a huge question. I know one of the questions is coming from Willis in West Point, and thank you for being here tonight, is, how would cities and local political subdivisions do without something like sales tax? Would come from property taxes if it didn't receive sales tax. And that's actually one of the things that we have talked about before at the Platt Institute, is that we would like local political subdivisions, if they're interested in replacing or reducing property taxes, to have more potentially local sales taxing authority where local voters would get to decide and get to have a voice on that. So from that, if I understand the question correctly, and if I didn't, you can correct me, Willis, both here or in the future. And yeah, some political subdivisions don't have sales taxing authority right now. And the question is, should they? Maybe they should if voters want them to. But those are some questions that, voters, when they get involved, are going to have to ask, both when it comes to the legislature and to ballot questions. And I think, Jim, we have kind of a tough question here we want to ask in one of our last polls.
We do. Let's poll this hard question. And we've asked this question before, but it's always interesting to see what's on people's minds as circumstances change. In order to reduce local property taxes, would you be willing to reduce government spending, even if it resulted in cuts to services including public education, local health programs, or road maintenance? Would you support those cuts, or are you opposed or undecided? And we've asked the same question in different regions, but because we're interested in how the results may differ, Sarah and Adam, we're running out of time here, but I want you to offer any thoughts on cutting spending as it relates to making a dent in property taxes.
Well, I think when we look at spending, we have to look at what we're spending on and what the results are. We can't just say, oh, we're spending more money, so the program's doing better. We have to look at outcomes and to see if we're successful, right? We don't just look at how much we spend on third graders. We want to look at how well third graders read and how, much math third graders can do. And so we need to look at outcome or performance-based budgeting, not just how much we spend. And I think if we start doing that, we can change the conversation and be more efficient in our government.
And what I would add to the spending discussion is it's so much easier said than done, because as Ron was talking about, you have everybody who is interested in cutting something that is important to somebody else. But when it comes to their own interests, they may not want to cut back on that. And it definitely, I've always likened it, because in the last year or so, I've had an opportunity to shed some pounds. And I've always said, it's like losing weight, where if you are not willing to make the changes about what you put in, you're not going to get any different results. So those are tough questions that people have to ask themselves. What do they want government to change? And one of the reasons that people might get frustrated with our discussion about how do you pay for it is that if you want really big reductions in property taxes, just like I wanted really big reductions in the amount of pounds I was showing on the scale, I had to make really big changes. And that's very difficult to do in a society where we all have different interests and different concerns, and when it comes to just cutting spending. Because if you wanted to cut, let's say property taxes a few years from now are $5 billion. So to cut that 20%, you need to cut $1 billion, which is a ton of money. So to think that in a legislature where you need 33 votes, you're going to be able to cut $1 billion without breaking a sweat is just not realistic. So you have to look at other ways that what are you willing to live with to have a tax structure that you think you would like to see for the future in your state? What would give you confidence about living in Nebraska so you wouldn't be as worried about property taxes if you're worried about property taxes? And so I think it's a balance of those things. What's the right spending priorities, and how do we want to pay for those priorities?
All right, thanks, Adam. Let's see the poll results from that tough question. 55% of you say that you would support making cuts in spending, even tough cuts to reduce property taxes. 18% are opposed, and 27% are undecided on that tough question. All right, we've had a great discussion tonight, but before we go, I want to make sure with those in attendance to see how our conversation has shaped your perspective about what ought to happen in Nebraska in the years ahead. So let's launch our final poll of the evening, Adam.
You got it.
All right, now that you've heard about some of the issues and potential ideas for property tax reform in Nebraska, who do you believe would do a better job of adopting changes to Nebraska property tax laws? Nebraska voters, the Nebraska legislature, or are you undecided? Give it a few seconds here. All right, Adam, let's see what those poll results are. All right, 45% of you say that Nebraska voters should decide how Nebraska's property tax laws should be changed. 27% the Nebraska legislature, and 27% are undecided. Very interesting. Thank you, Northeast Nebraska, for your participation. All right, everyone, thank you for joining us here tonight. We've reached our time limit. I'd be grateful for your feedback as the Platt Institute continues its work to remove barriers for Nebraskans. You can find the recording of this event soon and connect with me and my team anytime at plattinstitute.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and LinkedIn. Have a great evening, and we will see you next time. Take care.